which gender inequality is expressed is through the unequal distribution of care work, which reinforces the structural disadvantages that women and girls face in developing their autonomy. And so COVID-19 highlighted the value of the work of essential occupations such as health, care, and social work, but it also showcased the burdens of unpaid care and domestic work and how they were increasingly and exponentially increased during lockdowns. And although this is like an important topic for an equal future, there is actually lack of transparency and inconsistency of available information that makes it difficult to understand the causes and effects of gender gaps and economic recognition that care work deserves. And also we need to understand that care work data should also be used and shared with many across many sectors within the public sector. So, for instance, data assets in transport, public infrastructure, and education are also important to give context to these policies and to really implement them. But the lack of interoperability within these systems is also making policy design challenging. So we are here today to discuss which challenges we are facing, and also like try to understand who is actually working on this agenda. And we have three amazing speakers today. First, I want to introduce Neeraja Penumetcha, who is the Associate Director of Programs and Operations at Data2X, where she oversees work on tracking gender data gaps, improving measurement, and increasing technical capacity. Thank you, Neeraja, for joining us. Secondly, I would like to welcome Shelby Bourgault, who is currently the Gender Research Associate at the Center for Global Development, and she focuses on the gender impacts of COVID-19 and care work. Thank you for joining, Shelby. And lastly, I would like to introduce Andrea Ramírez, who is the Knowledge Management Director at the Secretaría Distrital de la Mujer de la Ciudad de Bogota. So before we start, I would like to repeat to panelists that they have 10 minutes for the presentation, and for the rest of us, there's translation to Spanish just in case you need so. You can click on the interpretation and jump into Spanish if you need. Feel free to also talk in Spanish and to make comments in the chat. So let's start with Neeraja's presentation. So whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. I will just share my screen. Please let me know, can everyone see this? Great. Well, I feel like actually, Flor, you covered quite a bit of what I wanted to cover, so I can jump right into the meat of things. But I thought I would start with just a quick introduction to Data2X, for those of you who may not be familiar. We are a civil society organization and gender data alliance, and we work to improve both the production and use of gender data through partnerships, research, advocacy, and communications. And I thought we could also just level set a little bit, and I could share the definition of gender data that we use and what I'll be referring to throughout this presentation. Some of you may already be familiar with this. This actually comes straight from the UN. I won't read all of this, but suffice to say, gender data are data that are disaggregated by sex, reflect gender issues. They can be either qualitative or quantitative. And critically, they take into account stereotypes and biases and try to account for that in the measurement process. So gender data is important. I don't need to tell this group that, but unfortunately, we continue to have significant gaps in it. Less than half of countries have the data necessary to monitor against SDG 5, which is the one on gender equality. With our partners at Open Data Watch, we have estimated that gender data systems are under-resourced by something close to $450 million per year, which of course will contribute significantly to those gaps. As Flor mentioned in her introduction, COVID-19 has of course exacerbated gender inequalities, brought to the forefront the necessity of care and the care economy, while at the same time it has also set back gender data collection and production efforts. And so at the time when we need it most, unfortunately, we don't necessarily have the data that we need. But in the instance that we do have that data and where we are able to collect it, how would that actually look, and how could we use that data? And so I wanted to share a couple of examples from the work that Data2X has been doing over the past few years that could speak to this. The first is around our understanding and measurement of the concept of work itself, and the idea that care work is in fact work and should be treated as such. As Flor mentioned, it is an important part of our contribution to the economy, and so we have to measure it as such. And as labor statisticians have started to acknowledge this fact and expand the definition of work, we have been working with the International Labor Organization, among others, to start to measure that care work as part of this expanded definition. The graph you see here is from some of the early pilot work that we did with the ILO on measuring with these new expanded definitions of work. And as this data started to come in, I think a couple of things became clear. One, I think this reinforced a lot of the things that we already knew, but very importantly, it started putting numbers and quantification around things that we just had some general sense of. So these are things like, we knew, I think, that women were significantly more engaged to do care work, but we didn't know quite by how much. We're starting to have some numbers around the number of hours per week, and the types of care work that they engage in. Second, really critically also, we've seen from these surveys that care work and other unpaid household work is in fact a significant barrier to women engaging in the economy in the way they want to. They're not taking jobs that they would prefer to take. They're not working as many hours as they would like to work. And so it's also indirectly harming the economy in this way, and kind of holding women back. So as we start to get this data, I think then the question becomes, well, how do we actually get this data practically and start using it in action and putting it towards policy? And for that, I want to go back to an example from some previous work that Data2X did, particularly around time use. So in early 2018, and I will pop links to all of these different resources in after the presentation, so please don't worry about having to scribble down the long titles at the bottom there. But early in 2018, Data2X published a case series that looked at the experiences of 18 different countries on collecting time use data and trying to use that to influence policy. And from that, we were able to develop this sort of rough chronology of the steps to go from data to policy. And, you know, this is a great theoretical figure, but I thought it would be most helpful to actually talk through one of these with a practical example. And so the one I wanted to share is around Uruguay. And if anyone on the call is either from there or has any familiarity with it, please feel free to jump in and supplement anything I'm saying. But first, I thought I'd set the background scene a little bit for where Uruguay was in the 90s. So a couple of things. One, within the country itself, there was already a significant and strong feminist advocacy movement. Apparently, it was the first country within Latin America to give women the vote, and so there was already this built-in movement to work from. Second, there was also a strong statistical tradition in Uruguay. So there was already a strong reliance on statistics, and data was already valued. So that's just sort of the kind of the ground that we were working on at that point. At the same time, in the 90s, at the kind of international and regional levels, there was also this significant push to actually start measuring care. This was mentioned at the 1995 Beijing conference, among other places. And so kind of these pieces taken together started pushing us in this direction. At the same time, we were also starting to see bits and pieces of data. There were several academic studies in the 90s around the care deficit and the care burden, but one in particular in 2003 really kind of pushed things forward and catalyzed work. And this was a survey that came out of the Universidad de la República. I apologize, my Spanish is non-existent. But they did a study in the Montevideo metropolitan area, and it was the first time, one of the first times that we could put a number around the care deficit in the capital region. So it was something that was sort of recognized by relevant policymakers. And this really became the thing that spurred a lot of the advocacy, and it resulted in the National Plan on Equal Opportunities and Rights, and that was passed a few years later, to actually include a specific call to action to measure unpaid work. And once you had this call now, then the National Statistical Institute had this mandate, and they went out and they collected high quality time use data across the entire country. And most importantly, they also disseminated that data back to the public. And in that process, fed back into the advocacy movement, who had now had additional data across the entire country that they could use to advocate from. With that data, they actually succeeded in having all major parties include care in their political platforms by 2009. And then this in turn led the government to actually take action. In 2011, they worked with civil society, academia, and a government agency focused on women to do a series of national conversations around the subject, which led to ultimately the decision to create this national care system that started implementation in early 2016. So as you can see, advocacy and data taken together really made this shift in policy happen. These are just a couple of the pieces that I kind of pulled out, both from this case study and a few of the others that seem to be relevant to how we can actually make this practical implementation leap. The first is that time use data is important, but it's not the only type of data. So thinking back to like the work data and some of the other pieces, yes, time use is great, but we do need these other pieces. Second, no single actor, no matter how powerful, is going to be sufficient to make this leap. It did require a group effort from all these different types of organizations. Third, data can both directly influence policy in that it can be used to set targets within policy and monitor against it, but really critically, it played an indirect role here as well in changing mindsets and bringing kind of this issue to the forefront. Fourth, this is probably the group I least have to tell this, but obviously dissemination of the data is so important to all of this. And then fifth, as I mentioned, the government was already kind of sold on the idea that data is important and women's issues were important. So it was a fertile ground that we were working on. So just finally, going back to this original question, then I won't go through this entire slide, but would love when we get to the discussion to hear from the folks in this call how they've seen this similar path happen, what was different, what was successful and useful. And with that, I will say thank you, and I will stop sharing and drop some links into the screen chat for everyone.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And in the meantime, while we are having the other two panels, I invite our members to start popping questions and try to think on how to answer Neeraja's questions. I see Paul in the call. So for example, something we were talking on Friday is that New Zealand has both the mandate of open data and statistics in the same office. So I assume that for them it's also might be easier and Paul can probably talk a bit more about that on how to integrate both agendas. That is something that we also see, that sometimes the statistics agenda is not completely aligned as there are different institutions within government. So yeah, I'm really looking forward on how to continue the discussion. So now it's time for Shelby. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Let me just share my screen as well. Okay, can you all see this fine? Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to take you through a paper that CGD did. We published this a year ago, but we've still been disseminating it. And most recently, we just presented it at the Feminist Economics Conference last month. But it's essentially a review of the Multilateral Development Bank's investments in childcare over the last 20 years. So first, I'll walk you all through the methodology, and I realize now I'm not. There we go, presenter mode, perfect. Okay, so we chose to search through 8 institutions and to compile the list of the MDB's childcare related projects, we searched each institution's database over the last 20 years using search terms like the ones listed below: childcare, creche, daycare, things like that, to get all the possible projects that we could capture that they've implemented. And when their databases weren't easily searchable, we use those same types of search terms just on their website to pull out relevant projects. And then finally, to make sure that we weren't missing really important work that they were doing, we shared our final list of projects with our gender leads at each of these institutions so that they could fill in any gaps that they knew of. In total, we found 362 projects that had a childcare component across those 20 years and all 8 institutions. And throughout the rest of the presentation, most of the findings will be for that total sample of projects. And that includes both projects where childcare was mainstreamed into other activities, such as a public works project that had an on-site childcare center, for example, and also projects where childcare was the main activity, which I'm going to be calling dedicated childcare projects. So as you can see from these graphics, the World Bank, even when separating out the IFC projects, accounts for 59% of the total projects in our sample, which is unsurprising given the volume of the projects that they implement overall. Looking at the amount of funding, we find a total of $33.6 billion US across that total sample for all institutions and all 20 years. But of this number, we don't know how much money went specifically to the childcare activities, which is really what we would want to know. And presumably it's a much smaller amount than that total number. But we do know that for the projects that were childcare dedicated specifically, we only found $2.09 billion US. And again, that's across 20 years and 8 institutions. So it's really not very much money. And to put that into context, we found that the World Bank alone, just in 2021, invested about the same amount in oil and gas projects. So it really is a pretty small amount of money that we're looking at overall thus far. In terms of the geographic spread, we see projects most highly concentrated in Latin America, but with Ethiopia and Bangladesh also receiving a large number of projects. And regionally, across all projects that we found, they're fairly evenly split between Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and then the rest of the world. For childcare dedicated projects, Latin America received over half, so about 52% of all projects were in Latin America. And this may be because among the regional MDBs, the IDB had the highest number of projects overall, and it was nearly double the amount of the next closest institution. Then we broke down the data into income level of the recipient country. And we see here that most projects went to middle income recipient countries, both lower middle income and upper middle income. Though a significant portion did go to low income countries, but ideally we would want that number to be higher. One of the more interesting findings of this work was we did sort of a timeline analysis of these projects. And from 2000 to 2021, there has been a clear increase in the volume of projects. And we can see significant jumps beginning in 2009, 2014, and especially 2019, 2020. So I think that this shows that overall childcare is being mainstreamed increasingly over a larger number of projects, and that more attention is being paid to it. But also that this increase may just be due to an increase in financing to the sectors where childcare is most easily attached to. So for example, increased financing for general education projects or general social protection projects. So to get more specifically at the childcare piece of that, this graphic is showing just those childcare dedicated projects over time. And here we see increases in 2012 and 2019, 2020 again, but we can also see that those gains are not sustained beyond that single year jump. And if we were to break that down into individual projects, we may find that those jumps are attributable to a single large project, perhaps. So now we're looking at, this slide here is covering just the pre-COVID 2019 and then the first year of COVID. And we wanted to look at this specifically because, of course, schools closed down, childcare centers closed down, but there was increased attention to childcare needs. So what was happening in those 2 years? So we see that since COVID hit, there have been more months with 0 dedicated childcare projects than there were compared to the year before. That being said, there is, of course, some lag time in when an issue gets more attention and when projects are actually implemented. So I'm hoping that the increased attention to childcare in the past 2 years will result in a higher volume of projects, but that has yet to be seen clearly. For sectoral analysis, we drew on the framework used in the World Bank's Better Jobs and Brighter Futures report, where they have these 7 sectoral entry points. And many of these categories overlap, and many projects are categorized as multiple categories and sectors, so the percentages won't add up to 100. But we see that half of projects we found are either broader education projects that include a pre-primary education component or an early childhood education component. And we also see that gender is the second most common sectoral entry point. And that's mostly as a cross-cutting category that has a lot of overlap with the other sectors. So it's rarely a solely gender-focused project. The second graphic here on the right shows the percentage of projects within each of those sectors that had a specific focus on gender. So we include this to see which sectors are most likely to highlight gender and women's roles as caregivers in the project, rather than focusing solely on outcomes for the children or childhood outcomes. And we see that gender is most prevalent in social protection and jobs projects, so that would include job training programs or public works programs that had a childcare component to it. And we see that in that category, nearly 3/4 of projects had a gender angle. Finally, the last bit of analysis we did was we wanted to see the extent to which childcare activities and associated outcomes are included in results framework. And of course, this goes back to the importance of data that we just talked about. So it's great that you're including a childcare project or component in these projects, but are you measuring any outcomes related to that? So this portion, we narrowed it down to only the projects that were completed or ongoing and that we could reasonably expect to have documents available for us to analyze. But we found that of those projects, only 87% had results frameworks that we could look at, and 64% of those included childcare related indicators. So of all these projects that ostensibly have childcare components, only 64% had indicators to actually measure anything related to those components. And unfortunately, most of those indicators are focused on outputs, so perhaps the number of facilities built, or on children's outcomes, which of course are very important. But we would love to see more of these projects having indicators related to women and caregivers and their outcomes from these programs. And finally, the last slide I've got before I wrap up is some ongoing work that I think will be particularly useful for this group. So we're currently doing 2 literature reviews on childcare. And the first focuses on the existing evidence of the return on investment for investing in childcare. So for that, we'll map the evidence on how investing in childcare yields returns in terms of increased economic activity or increased tax income for the government or increased business profits, things like that. So what is the tangible? If you invest $1, for every $1 you invest in childcare, you will get X amount in tax income or increased income for the family, et cetera. The second is going to be a systematic review of the evidence of what types of programs work for which contexts and for which populations. So this will look at specific models of childcare provision. So it could look at childcare subsidies versus publicly run childcare facilities or tax credits, and to see what of these models works for who and what levels, like, so for example, what level of childcare subsidy works for what kinds of populations, or at what level would you have to give a benefit in order to see a certain amount of employment outcomes. So both of these reviews are in early stages, unfortunately. I would love to bring some of this evidence to this conversation, but we're expecting them to hopefully be published by the end of the year. And yeah, would love to share with you guys when that's all available. So with that, I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Shelby. Thank you for your presentation, and we are really looking forward for the next steps on the research you mentioned at the last part of the presentation. Now I will give the floor to Andrea. Andrea, I'm not sure whether you want to do a presentation in Spanish or you will speak in...
Hola, voy a presentar en español.
Okay, so for people that want interpretation, you should click into English. So you have your interpretation on.
Vale.
Gracias, Andrea. Un gusto
Bueno,
tenerte
pues
acá.
gracias a ustedes por la invitación. Bueno, pues yo, como me presentaron, hago parte de la Secretaría Distrital de la Mujer de Bogotá, que como ustedes saben es una de las ciudades que ha empezado a implementar el sistema de cuidado para toda su población. Entonces, lo que les vamos a presentar hoy, lo que les voy a presentar hoy, es justamente los resultados de una primera medición de línea base del sistema de cuidado para Bogotá. Los sistemas de cuidado suelen estar asociados con las encuestas de uso del tiempo. Nosotros en Colombia tenemos una encuesta de uso del tiempo, pero el problema con esa encuesta es que no era representativa para cada una de las localidades o de las divisiones que tiene Bogotá. Bogotá está dividida en 20 localidades, en 20 secciones muy diversas entre ellas. Y por eso tener una línea base general o unas estadísticas generales para todo Bogotá era insuficiente para poder tomar mejores decisiones de política pública. Bueno, ustedes como sabrán, el sistema de cuidado de Bogotá está basado en la metodología de 3 indicadores o en la teoría de 3 indicadores de reconocer, redistribuir y reducir el trabajo de cuidado no remunerado, y dentro de los hogares y en general tanto con el sector público, con el sector privado, y esta línea base está basada en esos 3 puntos: reconocer, redistribuir y reducir. En este caso, lo que nosotros hicimos fue una encuesta de uso del tiempo para personas de 10 años y más que viven dentro de toda la vivienda, para tener una muestra final de 24.762 encuestas hechas en Bogotá, lo cual termina representándome un universo de 6.861.509 personas, que es lo que representa esta encuesta. Esta encuesta tiene entonces la facilidad de mostrar resultados por cada una de las zonas de Bogotá, pero además Bogotá tiene zonas rurales y urbanas, y también logramos hacer esa división entre zona urbana y rural. Entrevistamos a todas las personas adentro del hogar, porque para nosotros era fundamental saber cómo está el cuidado para hombres, para mujeres, pero también por los diferentes lugares que habían dentro de los hogares: hijos, padres, abuelos y demás. Les voy a mostrar solo algunos resultados muy pequeños, porque este estudio tiene 150 preguntas más o menos, 32 indicadores. Es una información que es pública, está abierta. Si alguna de ustedes quiere hacer un análisis con esta investigación, esta base de datos es completamente pública y está abierta para que quien quiera pueda hacer análisis. Además de esa encuesta, tuvimos un componente cualitativo de acompañamiento a la línea base, que fueron unos grupos focales con diferentes poblaciones y con personas ubicadas en diferentes lugares de Bogotá, que nos permitía entender mucho mejor la parte cuantitativa del estudio. Entonces, digamos, el primer resultado, que es el resultado básico que tiene que ver con cuidado y que es el uso, el tiempo que gastan las personas en cuidados de trabajo doméstico no remunerados, que es la famosa brecha entre hombres y mujeres. En Bogotá en este momento está en 2 horas 35 minutos. Las mujeres en general ocupan cerca de 6 horas y 8 minutos a trabajos domésticos no remunerados, y los hombres 3 horas 33 al día, con la diferencia de que 9 de cada 10 mujeres hace trabajos domésticos no remunerados y 7 de cada 10 hombres lo hacen. Y además, 30% de las mujeres en Bogotá hacen única y exclusivamente trabajos de cuidado no remunerado. No tienen ingresos, duran más de 6 horas haciendo este trabajo en el día, y en promedio tenemos que una mujer que solo se dedica a trabajos domésticos no remunerados en Bogotá dura 11 horas y 47 minutos haciendo este tipo de trabajos. Entonces, este es el gran indicador, este es el indicador fuerte y el indicador máximo de cuidado, como ustedes saben. Pero aquí parte de lo que nos parece importante y de lo que logramos fue tener esa brecha para cada una de las localidades, para cada uno de estos sitios que les contaba, por los cuales se divide Bogotá. Entonces tenemos localidades como Ciudad Bolívar, Bosa, Kennedy, ¿no? Son nombres un poquito extraños, donde esta brecha es de 3 horas 49, 3 horas 12, mientras tenemos otras localidades como Antonio Nariño, Teusaquillo, donde esa brecha ya es de 1 hora 23, 0 horas 55 minutos. Tiene que ver con que son localidades más jóvenes, donde tenemos mayor concentración de cuidado, donde hay muchísimos más niños, donde tenemos más necesidades, mientras las otras son localidades con edades promedio de personas viviendo entre los 25 y los 50 años, que tienen muchas menos necesidades de cuidado, donde además se tiene un poder adquisitivo mayor, y eso cambia completamente la brecha diferencial de tiempo entre hombres y mujeres. Para nosotros esto es fundamental. En Bogotá la gran apuesta del sistema de cuidado está dada por las manzanas del cuidado. Las manzanas del cuidado son unos espacios de aproximadamente 800 metros, casi 1 kilómetro, en los cuales se pretende concentrar todos los servicios de cuidado, tanto para personas que cuidan como para personas que requieren cuidado, para que las personas en Bogotá puedan ir a estas concentraciones, estar ahí y recibir todos los servicios en un mismo lugar. Entonces, bajo una política pública como las de Bogotá, en las cuales los recursos se tienen que priorizar, estas son herramientas de priorización, ¿no? O sea, no es lo mismo necesitar una manzana del cuidado o tener disponibilidad para una manzana del cuidado económicamente hablando y tener la posibilidad de hacerla en Teusaquillo o hacerla en Ciudad Bolívar. Entonces, esto nos ayuda a tomar la decisión de cuáles son los sitios prioritarios y cuáles son las adecuaciones que deben hacerse de forma más urgente en toda la ciudad. Otra de las cosas que quisimos hacer con esta línea de cuidado, que para nosotros fue muy importante y que no suelen tener las encuestas de uso del tiempo, es el tema de las creencias y las actitudes asociadas con los temas de trabajo de cuidado no remunerado. En Bogotá, por ejemplo, el 15% de las personas siguen creyendo que el trabajo de la casa, las labores domésticas no remuneradas, no son trabajo. Aquí pasa mucho que se le pregunta a los niños, por ejemplo, ¿qué hace su mamá? Y le responden, no, ella no hace nada porque todo el día está en la casa. Pues en Bogotá 15% todavía siguen pensando que los trabajos de cuidado no son trabajo, que eso no es un trabajo. Y como pueden ver a la derecha, si uno mira por sectores de Bogotá, por estas localidades, eso también cambia, ¿no? Entonces hay lugares donde el 25% de la gente cree esto, mientras hay otras donde solo el 8% cree esto. Eso también ayuda no solamente a cambiar o a optimizar la política de cuidado desde la prestación de los servicios y desde la forma en que le brindamos servicios de cuidado a las mujeres y a las personas cuidadoras en general, sino también implica cómo hacer las políticas públicas de transformación cultural necesarias para que efectivamente tanto la redistribución como la reducción como el reconocimiento se den en poblaciones que siguen teniendo unas creencias tan arraigadas a los temas de cuidado como esta. Otro tema que quisimos ver, siguiendo con el tema de las actitudes y creencias asociadas al cuidado, es, por ejemplo, este tema de que a los hombres se les dificulta cuidar a otras personas para hacer oficios del hogar. Como esta estrategia, como bien lo mencionaba una de las panelistas anteriores, son intersectoriales. La Secretaría de Cultura de Bogotá también está haciendo un trabajo muy fuerte a través de algo que se llama la Escuela de Cuidado para Hombres, que es enseñarle a los hombres cómo hacer labores de cuidado, que parece un tema menor, pero aquí no lo es. Sin embargo, el 57% de las personas en Bogotá cree que a los hombres se les dificulta aprender, ¿no? Y un 52% considera que si una casa o un hogar está sucio o desorganizado es porque le falta una mano femenina. Entonces, no solamente es enseñarles a cuidar, no solamente es enseñarles a hacer trabajos domésticos, sino que hay que cambiar y transformar estas creencias que tienen que ver con esto, ¿no? Entonces, claro, uno ve, por ejemplo, que son muy pocos hombres los que van a estas escuelas de cuidado, que cuando llegan es difícil, claro, porque estamos en toda una base cultural que perpetúa este tipo de creencias y que hace que los hombres sea más difícil que entren a las labores de cuidado y por lo tanto se dé la redistribución. Hay un tema que encontramos que no es menor, que nos parece muy complicado, y es que 30%, más o menos 2 de cada 6, 33% de personas, considera que quien menos gana dinero en el hogar es quien debe encargarse del oficio doméstico, ¿no? Entonces, estamos en un círculo vicioso en el cual obviamente las mujeres que realizan trabajo doméstico de forma exclusiva no tienen ingresos, pero además las mujeres que solemos tener salarios o ingresos mucho menores que los hombres, somos quienes terminamos haciendo además el trabajo doméstico en los hogares, porque existe la creencia de que el que menos dinero gana es quien debe realizar los trabajos domésticos. Entonces es un círculo vicioso en el cual las mujeres no podemos salir de ahí, no podemos tener menores ingresos y seguimos perpetuando estas creencias de que somos quienes tenemos que hacer el trabajo doméstico. Otro tema con respecto a las brechas, que es bastante importante, tiene que ver con la brecha del tiempo, no solamente en los trabajos de cuidado, sino en el autocuidado personal, ¿ya? ¿No? Entonces, cuando uno le pregunta a las mujeres qué tan importante es el autocuidado en su vida, el 93% de las mujeres nos dice, es muy importante el autocuidado, es muy importante cuidarse. Sin embargo, la brecha que existe entre actividades asociadas al autocuidado entre hombres y mujeres es de 20 minutos aproximadamente. Un tema muy fuerte que nos apareció es la diferencia entre la vida cultural, asistencia a eventos culturales, a eventos deportivos, que en los hombres suele ser de 1 hora 52 minutos al día y en las mujeres es de 1 hora 32 minutos al día. Ahí es donde más diferencia encontramos. Encontramos también diferencia ya en los tiempos de sueño, pero ahí es al revés, duermen mucho menos las mujeres que los hombres. Y en la vida social, que para nosotros además es un factor determinante de prevención de violencias, también vemos una diferencia de 10 minutos, no parece significativa, pero realmente lo es, de 10 minutos al día, donde las mujeres tienen menos vida social que los hombres. Acá está lo que les comentaba, perdón, no era 93, era 97% de las mujeres consideran que el autocuidado es muy importante. Pero esto, digamos, lastimosamente solo es en el discurso. Preguntamos también en esta encuesta acerca de problemáticas de salud de las mujeres cuidadoras, y nos dimos cuenta que el 33% de estas mujeres que se dedican de forma exclusiva al trabajo doméstico ya tienen enfermedades crónicas diagnosticadas, ¿no? O sea, 3 de cada 10 ya tienen enfermedad crónica, donde lo que más aparece son las enfermedades cardiovasculares y las enfermedades digestivas. Pero además, lastimosamente, de este 33% de las mujeres, de estos 33%, 9% de ellas no tienen ninguna forma de protección social, no están afiliadas a ninguna entidad de seguridad social, ni pública ni privada. Entonces son mujeres que están empobrecidas, están adentro de sus casas, con una sobrecarga de cuidado, sin tener ingresos, que ya están enfermas, con una enfermedad crónica, pero además no tienen acceso a salud. Entonces se vuelve un problema extremadamente grave para la ciudad. Eso es a grandes rasgos lo que les quería mostrar. Como les dije, esto es una investigación muy grande. Nos habían dicho que solamente teníamos 5 minutos, por eso recorté de esta forma. La información es pública, es abierta, y la idea de esta línea base es seguir haciéndola en Bogotá cada 2 o 3 meses para evaluar no solamente cómo ha disminuido o cómo mejora la brecha entre hombres y mujeres en temas de tiempo de cuidado, cómo suben o bajan los porcentajes de mujeres que se dedican exclusivamente a esto, sino también cómo hemos logrado o no transformar las creencias que asociamos con que esto pase, y evaluar también cómo esto se va moviendo por toda la ciudad, tanto en la parte territorial como también en el tema de edades, en el tema de niveles socioeconómicos de las mujeres, y ver dónde estamos logrando impactar y dónde nos falta impactar más. Muchas gracias.
Oh, muchísimas gracias, Andrea. Voy a seguir hablando en español, voy a aprovechar que tenemos interpretación. La verdad que tu presentación cerró muy bien todo lo que veníamos hablando, ¿no? De cómo necesitamos datos para visibilizar realidades, pero también necesitamos políticas públicas interseccionales que atiendan las necesidades de cuidado que tenemos todos o que tienen algunos. Y también me gusta mucho la visión de territorialidad que tienen, que todas las desigualdades no son las mismas, dependen mucho de dónde estamos, de dónde nacemos y hacia dónde vamos. Me parece que el trabajo que están haciendo es espectacular y cierra genial el hecho de que sea toda información abierta y disponible para que otras personas las puedan reutilizar, y también puede servir para academia, pero también para ONGs que trabajan con mujeres y niñas. Entonces, felicitaciones, fue espectacular esta presentación.
Y si tuviéramos más tiempo, Flor, de verdad que hay una infinidad de estadísticas. También parte de lo que hemos hecho es, no solamente en temas de cuidado, sino en temas de violencia, acceso a la salud, acceso a la vivienda, lograr información mucho más detallada para mujeres. Así que bienvenidísimas si quieren hacer investigación con esto, volvernos a invitar, todo está abierto para que lo puedan usar.
Mil gracias, Andrea. Ahora voy a abrir que las personas que están con nosotros hagan preguntas, cuenten sobre sus propios proyectos, les pregunten a ustedes qué dudas tienen. Entonces, cuando quieran, levanten la mano o abran el micrófono, que este es el momento de compartir. Tenemos 15 minutos para hacerlo. Me encantaría seguir hablando con las tres durante todo el rato, pero no sé si alguien quiere empezar, alguien del grupo. Cristian, adelante.
Gracias, Flori. Bueno, también voy a seguir en español y, bueno, primero, súper lo que presentó Andrea. Yo, así se nota en el acento, soy de Bogotá, a pesar de que vivo en Canadá, pero pues nací en Bogotá. Pero súper orgulloso de que la alcaldía esté haciendo eso. Y sí, algo que me di cuenta y que Flor también aludió es la granularidad en los datos por cada subdivisión de Bogotá, porque pues yo conozco entonces barrios como Kennedy o Bosa tienden a ser barrios de estatus más populares, gente que no tienen tanto dinero, que no tienen un estatus socioeconómico muy elevado, entonces me parece muy interesante poder ver esas diferencias. Supongo que mi pregunta esta también se va un poquito a Neeraja y a Shelby. En mis experiencias anteriores, yo trabajaba para el International Development Research Center, que donan mucho dinero a los temas de la economía del cuidado, y hemos visto un cambio en los intereses de gobiernos a no invertir en investigaciones tanto en estos ámbitos, sino se están yendo más por otros lados, como la inteligencia artificial y la salud. Entonces, ¿cómo desde una perspectiva de sociedad civil podemos navegar este mercado internacional que está cambiando, en donde ya no se está invirtiendo tanto en investigación para temas de care economy, de economía del cuidado? Gracias.
Anyone?
Shelby, maybe I start and you jump in? Okay. I mean, I think one of the things that we found in particular is there's actually a very strong economic case to be made for this, a huge economic case to be made for this. And it's unfortunate that that's where we have to go to. I mean, I think morally we should be doing this because it's the right thing. It's what our societies need. But people will listen to the economic argument. And if we can start to bring more of this data to bear, and in particular, Shelby, really interested in the work you're doing around the ROI, I think those types of studies will really open up the fact that these investments do pay back and do contribute to the economy in the same way that infrastructure or AI or any of these other things can as well. And once we have those numbers, I think we can make that argument. But Shelby, I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think especially agree that it's troubling that we do have to make this economic case, because as Andrea pointed out, leisure time is important. If we could do these programmings just for the sake of opening up leisure time for women, that in itself is of value and something worth investing in. But it seems that the climate now is more attuned to those economic arguments of, if you do this kind of investment, you're going to get this kind of employment outcomes and income outcomes. So I suppose, yeah, employing those to our advantage when we can. I think too that we can combine these conversations with conversations about climate change and green economy, because we know that we are going to have to invest in social infrastructure and in care work, and those are going to be sustainable jobs for the future. So where we can sort of connect the dots with other sort of advocacy lanes to our advantage is also something that we should pursue.
Bueno, pues no sé, a mí me pasó eso justamente en pandemia, porque era muy difícil decirle a una alcaldesa: usted tiene que invertir tantos miles de dólares en investigación en lugar de hacer asistencia social cuando estás en una ciudad como Bogotá, ¿no? Entonces, fue muy difícil, pero creo que se necesita realmente cabezas técnicas, como es en este caso la alcaldesa, que entiendan la necesidad de tener información. Porque también puede pasar eso, ¿no? Que uno tenga muy buena información estando en el sector público e incluso el sector privado tener muy buena información, pero que la toma de decisión no dependa de eso, ¿no? Y ese, desafortunadamente, es con lo que uno, siendo investigador dentro del sector público, es con lo que siempre tiene que luchar. Porque puede tener uno un gran argumento, pero puede ser que políticamente los intereses sean otros. Yo creo que eso es fundamental. Ahorita, por ejemplo, yo no sé si después de esta administración alguien vaya a seguir invirtiendo en tener una medición constante del cuidado, que es lo que nosotros hicimos y lo que queremos. Pero sí creo que mostrar la contraparte de la optimización en el gasto de recursos que se puede dar con esto es la forma en que uno termina casi que vendiendo la investigación para que sea acogida, ¿no? Entonces, no meta 20 manzanas del cuidado en Bogotá, todas a un mismo precio. Optimice porque usted va a tener mejor retribución, incluso política, si la enfoca justamente en estas zonas más populares y de mayor necesidad que en estas otras. Entonces, creo que es un trade-off en el que uno siempre está como negociando la propia investigación para que ellos desde su rédito político o el rédito que necesiten, sepan que no solamente es un tema porque es lo que toca hacer, sino que también puede tener unas ventajas políticas. Tristemente, así pasa.
Thank you, Andrea. Patty?
Thanks so much. First of all, I want to say thank you to all of the speakers. The work you're doing is so important. And Neeraja, I think you were the person who pointed out how fundamental this is to our understanding around the world of Sustainable Development Goal 5. Most of my work is on food and agriculture data and statistics, where we also have got big gaps, but there's been a lot of leadership internationally in trying to help countries improve their agricultural data. And we also have some technological approaches, using remote sensing that kind of leapfrog over the asking people, what are you planning to plant and how much did you actually get back from all of the effort you put into farming? So I was wondering, are there approaches like that, both internationally trying to get more government attention towards the necessity for collecting these kind of gender data, and are there other approaches? I can't think of any other than asking people, but are there other approaches that are being used as well?
Happy to start answering with what I know, but would love for others to jump in as well from their own experiences. I think we're currently seeing a lot of different approaches to thinking about time use methodology in particular, given how burdensome it is, and that has been one of the barriers to stronger use of it. The ILO is developing, with our support, a module that can be added onto the labor force survey that already goes out all over the world, that would start measuring this. UNSD, the UN Stats Division, has developed 2 different tools within the past couple of years, including one which is a rapid assessment tool that they specifically mid-COVID said, hey, we need to respond to this. How can we better do this? And put that tool out that's meant to be much, much lighter use and can be deployed very quickly. As to the question on kind of other methods, though, yeah, I think, Datatalks has looked at this since well before my time with the organization, but there's huge potential with big data and sort of all of the passive data collection and all of that. I think where we're at right now is finding the ethical and privacy supporting way to do that. Datatalks has done a ton of work in that space. Happy to drop some more links in the chat. But, I think it's an interesting space because this is also where, Andrea, as you mentioned, we can really start tapping into the private sector as well and start bringing in other actors with significantly more resources to bring to bear on this. So I don't have a great answer on like a single tool or anything, but I am excited by the potential available here.
The only thing I'd add is, yeah, most of our work is still just asking people and using that kind of data. But I think we're looking at also just the ways that you can make that process less burdensome for people. So new tools using social media, sort of survey dissemination, or other sort of digital tools, and ways to cut down on surveys and make the time burden less. And especially during COVID, when, you know, in-person survey collection was no longer possible largely. So the shift to more digital tools and lighter touch tools, I think, is going to continue.
Sí, en Colombia, digamos, y bueno, Bogotá es la ciudad más avanzada de Colombia en temas de acceso a Internet y acceso a otras cosas. Pues afortunadamente nosotros seguimos siendo un país donde no se tiene mucho acceso a temas digitales, por ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces, en Bogotá hay 1 de cada 4 mujeres no usa Internet todos los días, ¿no? Entonces, si nosotros quisiéramos hacer estudios a través de Big Data, de inteligencia artificial, que por supuesto me parecen maravillosos, estaríamos dejando un gran centro de población, un gran foco de población sin tener información real, que en parte para temas como cuidado terminan siendo las mujeres en las que tenemos que poner el foco. Entonces, yo también soy estadística, entonces soy altamente amiga de las encuestas. Creo que, pero por ejemplo, el trabajo cualitativo para nosotros ha sido fundamental, ¿no? Entender mucho más allá, porque por ejemplo, en la misma forma en que las mujeres narran los casos de violencia, por ejemplo, cuando llaman a nuestros servicios de atención de mujeres víctimas de violencia, cuando uno hace ya análisis de texto y hace realmente temas de inteligencia artificial con eso, empieza a ver las conexiones tan marcadas de los momentos de violencia que pasan cuando están ejerciendo labores de cuidado, por ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces, creo que hay que complementar, ¿no? Un poco todo con todo. Creo que quedarnos solo en encuestas también sería un poquito pobre, pero creo que al menos en ciudades como Bogotá, en países como Colombia, saltar a pensar que ya son las herramientas digitales las que nos dan todo el panorama puede ser un poco corto, pero sí creo que también ir avanzando con mejores formas de análisis de información y completar mayor información es lo que hay que seguir haciendo.
Thank you, Andrea. I think you made a really excellent point on the digital gaps. I would like to give the floor to Paul. Paul, are you there? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Andrea. Your presentation was really great and how it showed that there's a lot of different aspects to the problem. And I've been observing here in New Zealand, and a lot of attention on the gender pay gap, and that's closing. There are more women than men qualifying from university, and also because of good old COVID, we're a lot more flexible with our working styles. And I was wondering, particularly for those that have done any sort of international studies, how are you seeing any of these kind of changes that might influence a change in culture? Or what do you see anything in particular that's driving change in countries compared to other countries?
Bueno, si quieren yo empiezo respondiendo con el caso Bogotá. Pues digamos, el tema de transformación cultural acá es fundamental, y acá nos pasó algo muy curioso, Paul, y es que, por ejemplo, en pandemia se cerró la brecha económica entre hombres y mujeres. Entonces se vio como un gran éxito que lo estuviéramos cerrando, pero lo que realmente pasó fue que los hombres empezaron a ganar mucho menos dinero, ¿no? Entonces la brecha parecía más pequeña, pero realmente era que todos estaban ganando menos. Entonces, claro, también hay que entender muy bien la información para no creer que están pasando transformaciones culturales que realmente no están pasando. Eso nos pasó acá. Yo creo que, digamos, Colombia, y lo digo porque vengo hace mucho tiempo trabajando en temas culturales de otras cosas, ha logrado, sobre todo Bogotá, hacer transformaciones culturales muy fuertes en lapsos de tiempo muy pequeños. Bogotá históricamente, por una historia política en la cual las personas que llegan a dirigir Bogotá piensan en las transformaciones culturales. Incluso aquí se acuña el término cultura ciudadana hace más o menos 20 años, que después replica en muchas partes del mundo. Entonces se han tenido logros muy grandes, por ejemplo, en el tema de paso de peatones por la cebra, o en temas de disminución de homicidios, o en tema de disminución de lesiones. Entonces yo creo que somos una sociedad acostumbrada a los cambios culturales, pero donde los que menos se han permeado son los cambios culturales que tienen que ver con género. Entonces creo que es un gran reto para Bogotá. Creo que, si se dan cuenta, o sea, 80% de la gente cree cosas como que los hombres no hacen cosas no necesitan hacer trabajo doméstico, sino que ayudan dentro de la casa, ¿no? Entonces, o el 15% cree que eso no es trabajo, o el 70% creen que no se puede confiar en los hombres para criar niños, ¿no? Entonces, son transformaciones culturales grandes, son transformaciones culturales que llevarán tiempo, pero yo le apuesto a que Bogotá tiene una historia de transformación cultural y puede que pase, que tal vez la hagamos más rápido que otras ciudades.
Thank you, Andrea. I think we are running out of time. So I would like to, first of all, thank you, the three of us. This has been a really amazing implementation working group. We will publish a blog around this discussion, and we are really looking forward, probably after the summer, to reach back to you and follow up on your current research and your current work. Before we sign off, this will be our last meeting before the summer holidays. So for our implementation working group participants, I would like to say happy summer. We are not having any, well, happy winter in the case of the global in Latin America. So we are not going to have any meeting in August, but I wish you restful holidays. And I would also, before we log off, I would like to introduce Renato Berrino, who is the recent ODC research director. Would you like to say a few words, Renato, before we log off?
Thank you, Flor. Well, I'm really happy to be here. It's the beginning of my third week in ODC. I have just joined the organization as a research manager. So I'm going to help ODC to conduct and coordinate policy research in data, open data and data rights, especially focus on the main topics of the organization that are climate change, gender, and anti-corruption. And I'm gonna be joining all the implementation working group meetings every time I can, and I hope I can contribute and I can learn from you all as we did today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Renato. And well, this has been an amazing meeting. Thanks to you all. And well, see you in September. Thank you so much again. Bye.
See you.
Thanks.